Welcome to this episode. Today we are spending our time with one composer, a man who lived more than 400 years ago, and yet still shapes the sound of every opera house on the planet. His name was Claudio Monteverdi. He was born in the northern Italian city of Cremona in May of 1567, and he died in Venice in November of 1643 at the age of 76. In the course of that long life, he wrote 9 books of madrigals, church music on a grand scale, including a famous setting of the evening prayers known as the Vespers, and at least 3 operas that survive complete today, along with several more that are sadly lost. He lived and worked in 3 cities that shaped him profoundly: Cremona, where he was born and trained; Mantua, where he became a court composer and wrote his first operas; and Venice, where he spent the final 3 decades of his life as the master of music at St. Mark's Basilica. He married once to a singer named Claudia Cattaneo, and the couple had 3 children, though tragedy struck early and often in his family life. What makes Monteverdi remarkable is not just the beauty of his music, but the sheer drama of his biography. He lived through plague, war, the death of his wife and his favorite pupil within months of each other, decades of unpaid wages, a very public feud with a hostile critic, and finally a late flowering of creative genius in his 70s that produced some of the most emotionally raw and modern-sounding opera written in the 17th century. Historians often call him the bridge between the old world of Renaissance polyphony and the new world of Baroque drama. Some have even called him the father of modern music. By the end of this episode, I think you will understand why. So settle in, because this is a story with royal courts, secret alchemy experiments, forbidden books, a minotaur of self-doubt, at least one furious critic, and enough family heartbreak to fill a tragic opera of its own. Let us begin at the beginning, in the red brick city of Cremona. Chapter 1. Childhood and Youth. Claudio Monteverdi was baptized on the 15th of May, 1567, in the Church of the Saints Nazaro and Celso in Cremona. His father, Baldassare Monteverdi, was a barber, surgeon, and a doctor, a man of some standing in the city, careful with money and by all accounts a devoted family man. Claudio was the first of 5 children. His younger brother, Giulio Cesare, would also become a musician, and later in life would become one of Claudio's closest allies, acting as his secretary, copyist, and even his voice in a bitter public argument we will get to shortly. Cremona at that time was a wealthy but politically subdued city under Spanish administration, famous across Europe for its instrument-making workshops, the same workshops that would soon make the Amati family and eventually Antonio Stradivari household names among string players. It was also a deeply religious city in the grip of the Counter-Reformation, its bishops determined to stamp out any hint of Protestant influence and to encourage devotional music and strict moral behavior. Into this environment came young Claudio's teacher, a composer named Mark Antonio Ingegneri, who was the master of music at Cremona Cathedral. Ingegneri taught Claudio counterpoint, singing, the organ, and the viol, the ancestor of the modern viola. For years afterward, on the title pages of his earliest publications, young Monteverdi proudly described himself simply as pupil of Signor Ingegneri. It is likely that Claudio also attended the local university, founded centuries earlier by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, where he developed a lifelong passion for the philosophy of Plato, a passion that would surface again and again in his letters even decades later, when he was arguing about music theory with critics in Venice. Here is where the story gets genuinely astonishing. Claudio Monteverdi published his first piece of music, a collection of short sacred motets, in 1582, when he was only 15 years old. The following year, he published a book of spiritual madrigals, and the year after that, canzonettas, which were light popular songs. 3 publications in 3 consecutive years, each one showing more confidence than the last. One biographer describes this run of youthful publishing as a somewhat frenetic desire to establish himself, and it is hard to disagree. Imagine a 15-year-old today releasing not 1, but 3 professional albums in 3 years, each one showing serious artistic growth, all while still living under his father's roof. By 1587, at the age of 20, Monteverdi published his first book of madrigals for 5 voices, And this is the volume where his real talent finally breaks through. A perusal of the collection, one early biographer wrote, soon shows how faithless the disciple was, meaning that even though the teenager still called himself Ingegneri's pupil on the cover, the music inside was already pushing far beyond what his teacher would have approved of. In his dedication to a local nobleman who had supported him, young Claudio asked, with a nice touch of adolescent false modesty, that his youthful compositions be judged the way one judges the flowers of spring, delicate, new, not yet fully formed, but full of promise. It is a charming and rather sly line from a young man who clearly knew exactly how talented he already was. By his late teens and early 20s, Monteverdi was ready to leave Cremona and make his name in the wider world. He first tried his luck in Milan, where he won praise as a violist, and it was very likely there, sometime around 1590, that he first came to the attention of the ruling family of the nearby city of Mantua, the Gonzaga dynasty, who were always on the lookout for fresh musical talent. And so, still in his early 20s, Monteverdi packed his bags and headed for the court that would define the next chapter of his career, and indeed the whole future of European music. Chapter 2. Life and Career. Around 1590, Monteverdi was hired by Duke Vincenzo Gonzaga of Mantua, initially not even as a composer, but simply as a string player, valued for what one dedication calls his most noble practice of the viola. Mantua at the time was one of the great cultural capitals of Italy, a magnet for poets, painters, and musicians, a court obsessed with spectacle, festivals, hunting, and the arts. Duke Vincenzo himself was a genuinely colorful character. As a young man, he had once, in a dark alleyway, collided by accident with a Scottish scholar named James Crichton, a noted humanist. Words were exchanged, swords were drawn, and when Crichton, on realizing he was fighting the prince himself, knelt and surrendered his weapon, Vincenzo simply took the sword and ran him through with it. That is the kind of employer young Monteverdi found himself working for. In later life, Vincenzo mellowed somewhat, filling his court with astrologers and alchemists in an endless and famously unsuccessful quest to discover the secret of turning base metal into gold, a pursuit so well known that other European courts reportedly joked about the Italian duke, who spent his nights chasing an impossible dream. It did not take long for Monteverdi to fall in love at the Mantuan court. The object of his affection was Claudia Cataneo, daughter of one of the court's viol players. Duke Vincenzo gave his consent, and the two were married in 1599. Money, however, was a persistent problem from the very start of the marriage. Monteverdi's salary was startlingly small for a man expected to keep up appearances at a lavish court, and he was, in his own words, obliged to maintain a carriage, horses, and servants on wages that simply did not stretch far enough. This tension between prestige and poverty would follow him for the rest of his career. Monteverdi's early years at Mantua were not confined to music making within palace walls. In 1595, he accompanied Duke Vincenzo on a military campaign against the Ottoman Turks in Hungary, and it appears he witnessed the crushing defeat suffered by the imperial forces at the Battle of Carrestas. Historians have long suspected that this brush with the brutal reality of warfare later fed directly into the fierce, percussive, martial passages found in some of his most dramatic music, including the famous battle scene depicting the combat of Tancredi and Clorinda, written decades later. There was disappointment, too, when the long-serving court composer Gyaches de Wert died in 1596. Monteverdi, away on campaign at the time, was passed over for the top job, which went instead to a colleague named Benedetto Pallavicini. It was only after Pallavicini himself died in 1601 that Monteverdi was finally promoted to the position of Maestro di Cappella, the master of the court's music. In 1599, Monteverdi traveled with the Mantuan court on a long journey through the Alps into what is now Belgium and the Netherlands, stopping in Innsbruck, the fashionable spa town of Spa itself, Liège, Antwerp, and Brussels. This trip mattered enormously for his musical development. In Spa, he encountered French vocal styles, the elegant rhythms of French court songs known as airs de cour, and a movement of French composers who were trying to fit music to strict poetic meter in imitation of ancient Greek verse. His brother Giulio Cesare later credited this journey with reshaping Claudio's approach to setting words to music, an influence you can hear in the playful, rhythmically inventive pieces he later published under the title Scherzi musicali, which simply means musical jokes or musical games. Now we arrive at the year that changed everything, 1607, and the 2 years surrounding it, which together form one of the most dramatic personal chapters in the entire history of music. Early in 1607, Monteverdi's opera Orfeo received its first performance in Mantua. The libretto was written by Alessandro Strigio the Younger, secretary to the Gonzaga court, and a close correspondent of Monteverdi's for years afterward. In fact, the majority of Monteverdi's surviving letters, well over half of the 127 that have come down to us, are addressed to Strigio. Orfeo told the ancient myth of Orpheus descending into the underworld to rescue his dead wife Eurydice, and it fused a new, flexible style of sung speech, something contemporaries called speaking in song, with the kind of rich instrumental writing and choral grandeur that only a composer trained in the old madrigal tradition could have produced. It was an immediate sensation and is now regarded by most historians as the first true masterpiece of the operatic genre. But then, in a cruel twist that could have come straight out of one of his own operas, tragedy struck Monteverdi's real life almost immediately. That same summer, his wife Claudia, who had been unwell for over a year, died at his father's house back in Cremona on the 10th of September, 1607. Monteverdi was crushed, and yet almost before she was buried, a letter arrived from the Mantuan court ordering him to return immediately and begin work on a new opera, this one to celebrate an upcoming royal wedding. The new work was to be called Ariana, again based on Greek mythology, this time the story of Ariadne abandoned on the island of Naxos, and the libretto was provided by the poet Ottavio Rinuccini. As if this were not enough sorrow for one man to bear, a second blow followed only months later. Monteverdi's brilliant young pupil, a soprano named Caterina Martinelli, who had actually been living in Monteverdi's own household while training under him, died suddenly of smallpox in March of 1608, only weeks before she was due to create the title role of Ariadne on stage. The role passed instead to an actress and singer named Virginia Andreni, known by her stage name La Florinda, and her performance of the opera's central number, The Lament of the Abandoned Ariadne, was said to have moved the entire audience to tears. One eyewitness wrote that there was not one lady who failed to shed some little tear. That lament, incidentally, is the only music from the opera Ariana that survives today, because the rest of the score has been lost to history. But the lament alone was so admired that Monteverdi later reworked it as a piece of sacred music, transforming Ariadne's grief over her lost love into the Virgin Mary's grief over the crucified Christ. Monteverdi himself later admitted that the punishing deadline for Ariana, arriving right on top of his personal grief, very nearly killed him. In a remarkably blunt letter written in December of 1608, he complained to a Mantuan official that the very air of the city would soon be my death, and asked outright to be released from service. It is a startlingly direct thing to say to your employer, but it captures the man's character well. He did not suffer in silence. He wrote it all down, in vivid, sometimes furious detail, and thanks to that habit, we know his inner life in a way we simply do not for most composers of his era. Around this same period, Monteverdi also found himself at the center of a genuinely entertaining public controversy. A theorist from Bologna named Giovanni Maria Artusi had, since the year 1600, been attacking Monteverdi's music in print, accusing him of breaking the sacred rules of counterpoint, singling out one of his madrigals as an example of everything wrong with modern composition. Monteverdi mostly ignored him for years, but eventually responded with a short preface to his fifth book of madrigals in 1605, in which he coined a phrase that would echo through music history ever after, the term second practice, meaning a new style in which the emotional meaning of the words is allowed to override the strict textbook rules of harmony. His brother Giulio Cesare then went further, publishing a much longer and more sarcastic defense in which he compared Artusi's arguments to hearing a madman reason. It was, in short, one of the great musical feuds of the era, theorist versus practitioner, rulebook versus raw expression, and history has firmly sided with Monteverdi. Not everyone was hostile, of course. Far from it. The young German composer Heinrich Schütz was so struck by Monteverdi's originality that he traveled all the way to Venice in 1628 specifically to meet him. A French viol player named Maugars, after hearing his music while traveling through Italy, called Monteverdi one of the first composers in the world. Even the composer Jacopo Peri, whose own early experiments in sung drama had helped inspire Monteverdi in the first place, later openly imitated the emotional intensity of Monteverdi's laments in his own work. For his own part, Monteverdi expressed deep admiration for the old Flemish master Arcadelt, praising him for what he called the simplicity of style, the transparent harmonies, the broad, well-defined melody, qualities Monteverdi clearly still valued, even as he was busy breaking rules in his own compositions. Let us pause for a moment on the sheer scale of what Monteverdi was juggling during those years at the Mantuan court, because it helps explain both his exhaustion and his genius. He was not simply a composer sitting quietly at a desk. He was a performing violist, a singer, a vocal coach responsible for training some of the finest young voices in Italy, a talent scout expected to travel and negotiate with the families of prospective singers, and eventually the administrator in charge of an entire musical establishment that had to produce ceremonial music for church services, private entertainments for the Duke and Duchess, elaborate multi-day wedding festivities, and eventually full-scale operas, all more or less simultaneously and usually on brutally short deadlines. The recruitment of the young singer Caterina Martinelli is a perfect example of just how much delicate diplomatic effort went into simply staffing the court's musical life. Letters flew back and forth for months between Mantua and Rome as officials tried to persuade the girl's family to let her travel north, arguing over her age, her virtue, her voice, and eventually her exact travel itinerary, all before she had sung a single note for the Gonzaga family. Once she arrived, she was placed to live directly in Monteverdi's own household, both for practical training purposes and to guarantee, in the rather old-fashioned language of the time, her safety and her reputation while she was still a young teenager living far from her own family. This tells you a great deal about the strange blend of intimacy and formality in Monteverdi's professional world. His home functioned simultaneously as a family residence and as something close to a conservatory dormitory. It is also worth pausing on just how differently the sexes were treated within this musical world. Female singers at the Mantuan court, however brilliant, existed in a state of constant vulnerability, dependent on the whims, protection, or unwanted attention of powerful men. The court's most celebrated prima donna during Monteverdi's early years, a singer named Adriana Basile, was pursued by the Duke with a diplomatic intensity that one contemporary observer wryly compared to negotiating a treaty with a foreign power. It took less effort, this observer joked, to actually negotiate a treaty than to secure the services of one particularly gifted virtuoso. This is the world Monteverdi worked within his entire adult life, a world of enormous artistic ambition built on top of an equally enormous structure of patronage, favoritism, and precarious personal safety for the women whose voices made so much of that ambition possible. In 1612, Duke Vincenzo Gonzaga died, and his successor almost immediately dismissed Monteverdi from Mantuan service, reportedly without even settling the wages still owed to him. After a period of uncertainty living once again in his father's house back in Cremona, fortune finally turned decisively in Monteverdi's favor. In August of 1613, he was appointed Maestro di Cappella at St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, one of the most prestigious and best-paid musical posts anywhere in Europe. The move to Venice transformed his life. For the first time, he was well-housed, well-paid, and kept busy enough to guarantee a constant stream of new compositions. His letters from this period show him behaving almost as a social equal among the Venetian aristocrats he served, rather than as a humble servant, a striking change in tone from his desperate, pleading letters written in Mantua. Family life continued alongside his musical career. His son Francesco, who had a fine tenor voice, eventually abandoned the legal career his father had planned for him and joined the choir at St. Mark's as a singer in 1623, after a brief detour during which he actually took holy orders as a Carmelite monk. His other son, Massimiliano, studied medicine in Bologna, as his father had hoped, but ran into serious trouble around 1627 when he was arrested and imprisoned by the religious authorities for possessing forbidden books. It took the intervention of Monteverdi's old friend and former patron in Mantua, Count Strigio, to secure his release, a crisis that must have caused the aging composer enormous anxiety. Venice itself was struck by a devastating outbreak of plague between 1630 and 1631, which killed close to a third of the city's entire population. Monteverdi survived, and in gratitude he vowed to make a pilgrimage to a shrine dedicated to the Virgin Mary. He also composed a solemn requiem mass that was performed at St. Mark's in November of 1631 to mark the official end of the epidemic. It was around this traumatic period that Monteverdi decided to take holy orders himself and become a priest. Though interestingly, this change brought no noticeable shift in the passionate, sometimes frankly erotic subject matter of the secular madrigals and operas he continued to write for the rest of his life. Financial troubles never entirely disappeared either. He spent years chasing payment of a modest pension he was owed from his old post in Mantua, and after the city of Mantua itself was catastrophically sacked by invading imperial troops in 1630, that income, along with various family property interests tied to the city, was lost for good. Chapter 3. Final Years. Here is something that might surprise you. Claudio Monteverdi never really retired at all. He remained the master of music at St. Mark's Basilica right up until his final year of life, and if anything, his creative output actually accelerated in old age rather than slowing down. In 1641, at the age of 74, he published a massive collection of sacred music called the Selva Moral e Spiritual, a title that translates roughly as a forest of moral and spiritual songs. And in these same final years, he composed two of what are now considered his very greatest operas, The Return of Ulysses to His Homeland in 1640 and The Coronation of Poppaea in 1643, both written for Venice's exciting new public opera houses, an entirely new kind of commercial theater that had only just come into existence in the 1630s, allowing ordinary paying members of the public, not just aristocrats at private court entertainments, to attend performances of opera for the first time in history. In the spring of 1643, now 75 years old and feeling his strength failing at last, Monteverdi obtained official leave from his employers and set off on a long journey back through Lombardy, revisiting Cremona and other towns and cities he had not seen in many decades. He was received everywhere, we are told, with a triumphant welcome, an old master coming home one final time. Some historians believe he was hoping this trip might finally secure him a comfortable church appointment back in his native Cremona, something he had actually applied for unsuccessfully as far back as 1627, which would have let him spend his final years in the city of his birth. It was not to be. He fell ill on the road, and rather than staying to recover elsewhere, he insisted on returning to Venice to die there. One of his early biographers, in a beautifully poetic line, wrote that he did this like the swan who, feeling his end near, returns to the water. Claudio Monteverdi died after 20 days of fever on the 29th of November, 1643. His funeral was a genuinely grand affair. The Church of the Frari in Venice was ablaze with candles, and the city's finest singers performed under the direction of an old friend, the bass singer Giovanni Battista Marinoni, nicknamed Jupiter, who had actually traveled with Monteverdi all the way back on that difficult military campaign in Hungary nearly 50 years earlier. A separate memorial mass was also sung at St. Mark's, led by his eventual successor in the post, Giovanni Rovetta. Poets across Italy continued writing elegies and sonnets in his honor for a full 2 years after his death. And then, remarkably, he was almost completely forgotten. Musical fashion moved on with startling speed in the following decades, and by the end of the 17th century, Claudio Monteverdi's name had faded almost entirely from public memory, remembered only by a handful of specialist scholars who kept copies of his madrigals as historical curiosities. It would take more than 200 years, and a landmark revival of his opera, Orfeo, staged in Paris in 1904 by the composer Vincent d'Indy, to finally bring Monteverdi back into the spotlight and restore him to the position he now holds as one of the true founding figures of Western classical music. It is worth spending a little more time here on exactly what made the new Seconda Pratica so controversial, because to modern ears used to centuries of dissonance and dramatic musical gesture, it can be hard to appreciate just how radical Monteverdi's choices sounded to his contemporaries. In strict Renaissance counterpoint, dissonant intervals, notes that clash uncomfortably against each other, were supposed to be carefully prepared and then resolved according to well-established rules, almost like a grammatical structure that could not be broken without sounding like an error. Monteverdi, particularly in his madrigal Cruda Amarelli, the piece that first drew Artusi's public criticism, allowed dissonances to appear suddenly and to resolve in unconventional ways, specifically because the poetic text at that moment described cruelty, pain, or emotional anguish. His argument, made through his brother's published defense, was essentially that music exists to serve poetry and human feeling, and that if a strict rule of harmony gets in the way of expressing the true emotional content of a line of verse, then the rule, not the expression, should give way. This might sound like common sense to us now, because virtually all subsequent Western music has absorbed this exact principle, but at the time it represented a genuine philosophical break from more than a century of established compositional practice. Artusi, to be fair to him, was not simply a reactionary crank. He was defending a coherent and long-respected theoretical tradition, and the debate between the two men, or more precisely between Artusi and Monteverdi's brother acting on Claudio's behalf, really does represent one of the great intellectual turning points in the history of Western music. The moment when expressive freedom was formally and publicly asserted as a legitimate compositional value in its own right. There is a similarly important technical point worth making about Monteverdi's use of instruments, something that often gets glossed over when people simply praise him as an emotional innovator. His printed score for Orfeo lists an extraordinarily large and specific orchestra for the time, including multiple types of viols, cornets, trombones, harpsichords, harps, recorders, and a small portable organ, and he assigns different instrumental colors to different dramatic locations and emotional states with remarkable consistency. Trombones and low brass accompany the underworld and death. Delicate strings and harps accompany scenes of pastoral innocence and love. This was not entirely without precedent. Similar associations between instrument type and dramatic mood had been developing throughout the late 16th century in religious dramas and courtly entertainments. But Monteverdi assembled these existing conventions into a far more sophisticated, sustained, and dramatically purposeful system than anyone had attempted before him. He also pioneered the use of short recurring instrumental passages functioning almost like a musical signature for a particular character or idea, an early ancestor of what later composers would call a leitmotif, reappearing at key moments throughout Orfeo to reinforce the drama's emotional and structural unity. In other words, alongside his famous revolution in vocal writing, Monteverdi was quietly conducting an equally important revolution in how an orchestra could be used to tell a story. And this side of his achievement deserves just as much credit as the more frequently discussed vocal innovations. Chapter 4. Musical Development and Historical Impact. If you want to understand how Monteverdi's music changed over his lifetime, it helps to think of his career mapping quite neatly onto his three cities. In Cremona, under the strict guidance of his teacher Ingegneri, he was drilled thoroughly in the old Renaissance rules of counterpoint, the careful, mathematically governed interweaving of independent vocal lines that had dominated European sacred and secular music for over a century. This was his foundation, and he never entirely abandoned it. Even in his most radical later works, you can still hear the ghost of that rigorous training underneath. In Mantua, everything opened up. Exposure to the spectacle-obsessed culture of the Gonzaga court, to the French vocal styles he encountered on his travels to Spa and Flanders, and above all to the brand-new experiments coming out of Florence, where a group of composers and intellectuals were trying to recreate what they imagined ancient Greek musical drama must have sounded like, pushed Monteverdi toward what he himself called the second practice. This was essentially permission to break the textbook rules of harmony whenever the emotional truth of the words demanded it. His opera Orfeo in 1607 represents the first full flowering of this idea on a grand scale, combining that new expressive, speech-like singing with a kind of rich orchestral color and choral writing that only a composer steeped in the old madrigal tradition could have achieved. Contemporary critics noted that where earlier Florentine experiments in sung drama could feel dry and lifeless, Monteverdi's music was, in their words, far removed from hollow narration. And it is difficult not to wonder whether the emotional extremity of the period surrounding 1607 and 1608, the death of his wife, the frantic deadline, the death of his pupil, all crashing down within months of each other, sharpened the raw emotional intensity that pours out of his laments from this period, especially that famous lament of Ariadne, which so moved its first audience to tears. In Venice, freed at last from the demands and unpredictable whims of a single aristocratic patron, and immersed instead in a wealthy, sophisticated commercial city that was just then inventing public opera as we would recognize it today, Monteverdi's style loosened and diversified even further. He developed what musicologists call a concertato style, mixing virtuosic solo singing, small vocal ensembles, and colorful instrumental writing in endlessly inventive combinations. This mature style is fully on display in his enormous eighth book of madrigals, published in 1638, which contains over 30 individual pieces exploring both the passions of love and the brutality of war. In that same collection, Monteverdi introduced a technique entirely of his own invention, which he named the agitated style, built from rapid, urgently repeated notes designed specifically to depict anger, conflict, and the chaos of battle. He had already tested this technique a few years earlier in a dramatic scene called The Combat of Tancredi and Clorinda, based on an episode from an Italian epic poem in which a knight unknowingly fights and mortally wounds the woman he loves, disguised as an enemy soldier. It remains one of the most viscerally exciting pieces of music from the entire 17th century. His final two operas, The Return of Ulysses and The Coronation of Poppaea, pushed even further into psychologically complex, morally ambiguous territory. Poppaea in particular tells a genuinely shocking story for its time: the rise to power of a manipulative and ultimately triumphant mistress, with almost none of the moral punishment or redemption you might expect from a 17th century drama. These late works pioneered a fluid, ever-shifting alternation between speech-like recitative and more melodic song-like passages, a technique that shaped the entire future development of Italian opera and directly influenced younger composers working in Venice at the time, including Francesco Cavalli, Marc Antonio Cesti, and Luigi Rossi. Scholars studying the later history of opera have even drawn direct comparisons between Monteverdi's dramatic instincts and those of Giuseppe Verdi, working 2.5 centuries later, both composers using free-flowing, dramatic recitative to serve the emotional truth of a story rather than locking themselves into rigid musical forms. Taken together, this is why historians so consistently describe Monteverdi as the essential bridge figure between the Renaissance and the Baroque, the composer who took the old world of intricate vocal polyphony and welded it permanently to the new world of dramatic, emotionally driven musical theater. Some writers have gone so far as to call him the father of modern music, and one 18th century reference book, only slightly hyperbolically, called him the Mozart of his time. Given that opera as an art form still 400 years later rests on the basic idea that music should serve the emotional truth of a story rather than an abstract set of rules, it is hard to argue with that assessment. Chapter 5. Life Apart from Music. For all his fame as a composer, Monteverdi was also a genuinely well-read, self-educated man, and his surviving letters reveal a mind engaged with far more than just musical technique. He returned again and again in his writing to the philosophy of Plato, a passion that reportedly took root during his student years back in Cremona and never left him. One biographer notes that his correspondence shows a culture remarkable even at a time when musicians were on the whole more lettered than they usually are today. which is a polite way of saying that even by the standards of his own well-educated era, Monteverdi was unusually intellectual for a working musician. If Monteverdi had one genuine hobby outside of music, it was, delightfully, alchemy. According to contemporary accounts, his only recreation was alchemy, and whenever he found himself with a spare moment, he would apparently spend it chasing the ancient dream of transforming base metals into gold. He was, we are told, extremely proud of having once managed to fuse gold with mercury, though he seems to have had few real illusions about ever achieving the philosopher's stone itself. There is something wonderfully human and even a little comic about this image. The most emotionally penetrating composer of his generation, spending his rare free evenings hunched over bubbling flasks, trying to strike it rich through pseudoscience, just like his eccentric former patron Duke Vincenzo Gonzaga, whose own alchemical obsessions had once been the subject of jokes across half of Europe. Religion played an increasingly important role in his later life. Following the trauma of the Great Venetian Plague of 1630 and 1631, which he survived while so many around him did not, Monteverdi made a pilgrimage vow and eventually took holy orders as a priest himself. Interestingly, though, this spiritual turn seems to have had little visible effect on the actual content of his music. He continued composing intensely passionate, sometimes frankly sensual secular madrigals and operas about love and betrayal right alongside his sacred compositions, suggesting that for Monteverdi, as for many musicians of his era who took religious vows, ordination was as much a practical career step, something many senior church musicians did as a matter of course, as it was a sign of some deep personal transformation. Family mattered enormously to him, even if he could be a demanding father. He hired a private tutor for his two surviving sons and had clear career plans in mind for both of them, hoping Francesco would become a lawyer and Massimiliano a doctor, following rather directly in his own father's footsteps as a physician. Both sons, in their own ways, disappointed and then eventually charmed him by choosing very different paths, Francesco drawn irresistibly into music through his fine singing voice, and even flirting briefly with monastic life, and Massimiliano running into serious legal and religious trouble over his private reading habits. Beyond his own compositions, Monteverdi also functioned as something like an informal talent agent and consultant for other European courts, regularly asked by wealthy patrons to help identify and recruit promising young singers and instrumentalists, a role that made full use of his decades of experience judging voices at both the Mantuan and Venetian courts. He was also, it must be said, not a man who avoided conflict. When tangled in a lengthy and frustrating legal dispute over his late father-in-law's estate, he memorably compared the whole exhausting process to being trapped in a Socratic labyrinth, a philosophical maze from which the arguing parties could never quite escape, no matter how many clever points they made. It is a wonderfully literary complaint for a man to make about a property dispute, and it tells you a great deal about the kind of mind Monteverdi had: quick, well-read, a little theatrical even in his own personal correspondence, and never afraid to express exactly how he felt. One more thing deserves mention when it comes to Monteverdi's life outside music, and that is his sheer stamina and work ethic, which by any standard was extraordinary. Surviving letters from a single representative year, 1627, give us a vivid snapshot of just how many projects he was juggling at once even in his own 60s. In the spring of that year, he was simultaneously setting music from the poet Tasso to depict a duel between two warriors, composing an entirely separate opera intended for the court at Mantua, preparing elaborate musical interludes, and a stage tournament for festivities at the court of Parma, organizing solemn commemorative music for the Venetian Senate to mark a naval victory decades earlier, continuing his regular weekly duties directing the choir at St. Mark's, and correcting proofs for a new printed edition of madrigals by an older Flemish composer he deeply admired. In the middle of all this frantic activity, he also complained, in a letter that has survived to us, of a painful inflammation affecting his eye, apparently a chronic problem that periodically left him unable to read or write at all for extended stretches. A genuinely alarming condition for a man whose entire livelihood depended on being able to see musical notation clearly. Reading through this kind of correspondence, it becomes very hard to sustain the outdated image of the reclusive, artistic genius working in solitary inspiration. Monteverdi was, first and foremost, an extraordinarily hard-working professional, constantly negotiating deadlines, managing other people's expectations, and somehow still finding time in the margins of all this activity to develop some of the most emotionally sophisticated music Europe had ever heard. Modern scholars examining his personal correspondence have also noted his genuinely wide network of professional friendships and rivalries across Italy. He maintained warm, respectful relationships with fellow composers he considered his equals, exchanging musical ideas, recommending singers to one another, and occasionally collaborating directly on shared projects for royal weddings and other grand occasions. At the same time, he was not above sharp, sometimes cutting private remarks about musicians he considered inferior or opportunistic, particularly when he felt they were receiving favors or commissions he believed he himself deserved. This combination, genuine collegial warmth toward those he respected paired with an unmistakable competitive edge toward rivals, paints a picture of a man who took his own professional standing extremely seriously. Something that should not surprise us given just how precarious and status-conscious the world of court patronage actually was during this period. Chapter 6. Where to find him today. The most important dedicated institution is the Fondazione Claudio Monteverdi, a foundation established in Cremona in 1971 by the Italian government specifically to publish the complete scholarly edition of Monteverdi's works and to sponsor historically informed performances of his sacred and secular music. If you are the kind of listener who wants to dig into primary sources and critical editions, this foundation's publications are the gold standard. Cremona itself hosts the Monteverdi Festival, an annual celebration of Baroque music organized through the city's Teatro Ponchielli, now well into its fifth decade of existence. In recent years, it has drawn genuinely major international names, including the superstar mezzo-soprano Cecilia Bartoli and leading period instrument conductors, and it typically combines full opera productions with smaller concerts, guided walks around the historical sites connected to Monteverdi's life, and academic symposia examining new research into his biography and music. Cremona's Museo del Violino, the city's celebrated violin museum, built around its extraordinary heritage of instrument makers, including the Amati family and Antonio Stradivari, has also hosted major exhibitions connecting Monteverdi to the visual and material culture of his era. One particularly notable exhibition in 2017, marking the 450th anniversary of his birth, reconstructed the actual instruments listed in the printed 1609 score of Orfeo, allowing visitors to see and hear the specific combination of trombones, cornets, harps, and viols that Monteverdi originally called for. On the performance side, one name looms especially large in bringing Monteverdi's music to modern audiences: the British conductor Sir John Eliot Gardiner, who founded and continues to lead two ensembles that actually bear the composer's name, the Monteverdi Choir and the English Baroque Soloists. These groups remain among the most celebrated interpreters of his sacred and secular music anywhere in the world, and recordings by these very ensembles, somewhat unexpectedly, have found their way into major Hollywood film soundtracks in recent years, appearing in movies including The Wolf of Wall Street, The Batman, Napoleon, and Ferrari. Proof that music written in the 1500s and 1600s can still land with real emotional force in a 21st century multiplex. Monteverdi's actual birthplace and baptismal church back in Cremona, the Church of the Saints Nazaro and Celso, still stands and remains a site of pilgrimage for scholars and devoted enthusiasts of early music. Italian universities and conservatories, including scholars connected with the University of Pavia, continue to host academic conferences exploring new archival discoveries about his life, his letters, and the world of the Mantuan and Venetian courts he moved through. And of course, beyond Italy, early music ensembles across the world, from the Netherlands to the United States, regularly perform and record his three surviving operas and his vast body of madrigals and sacred music, ensuring that this composer, who was so completely forgotten for 2 centuries, is now, if anything, more widely performed and more deeply studied than at almost any point since his own lifetime. It is also worth noting for any listener who might be planning an actual visit that the city of Mantua itself, though it does not host a dedicated Monteverdi museum in the way Cremona does, remains rich with sites connected to his most dramatic years. The ducal palace where Orfeo and Arianna were first staged still stands, along with the smaller theatrical and ceremonial spaces used by the Gonzaga family for their lavish entertainments. Visitors interested in the broader context of Renaissance and early Baroque court culture that shaped Monteverdi's early career will find the palace's surviving apartments, frescoes, and historical collections a valuable complement to any dedicated Monteverdi-themed trip that begins in Cremona and ends fittingly in Venice, where his tomb can still be visited today in the great Franciscan church of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari. Resting, by pure historical coincidence, in the same building that also houses masterpieces by Renaissance painters, including Titian, a fitting final resting place for a composer who spent his own long life balancing tradition and innovation. Summary. Claudio Monteverdi was born in Cremona in 1567 and died in Venice in 1643, a life that carried him through three defining cities: Cremona, where he trained as a strict Renaissance polyphonist under his teacher Ingegneri; Mantua, where he became a court composer and produced his groundbreaking early operas while enduring genuine financial hardship and devastating personal loss; and Venice, where he spent his final 3 decades as master of music at St. Mark's Basilica, rising to a level of prestige and creative freedom he had never known before. Along the way, he married once to Claudia Cataneo and endured the death of his wife and his most gifted pupil within months of one another. Right in the middle of composing one of the most demanding projects of his career, he fought a public battle with a hostile theorist and, in doing so, gave music history one of its most important new ideas: the notion that the emotional truth of a text should be allowed to override the strict rules of counterpoint whenever the two come into conflict. He survived a devastating plague, later took holy orders, pursued alchemy in his rare free hours, and remained astonishingly productive right into his mid-70s, capping his career with 2 of the most sophisticated and psychologically daring operas of the entire century. He was, in short, both a supremely disciplined craftsman and a restless innovator, a devoted, if demanding father, a man capable of writing furiously blunt letters to his employers one week and profoundly moving laments the next, and a composer who somehow managed to be almost completely forgotten for 200 years before being triumphantly rediscovered and restored to his rightful place among the very greatest figures in the history of Western music. Thank you for spending this episode with Claudio Monteverdi. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of music history's most dramatic and consequential lives, please share it with your friends and rate this podcast. It really helps us.